We have the great pleasure today. I'm truly honored and very excited about learning more about a hospital that was certainly here in St. Louis when I was a child. Was a big staple in St. Louis, from Dr. Candace O'Connor, excuse me.
I'm just a regular person, no doctor.
You're not?
No.
Well, take it when I give it to you.
Oh.
Sorry. At any rate, who has brought with her 3 of the nurses who had also worked there. I'm going to let Candace introduce herself and tell us all about Homer G. And as you can see, when we're completed, there's a wonderful display that I need to want to look through myself here. So I won't say anything more. You take it away, please.
Sure.
Well, thanks so much to Vi and to the Mason Point staff for the invitation to come today. I wrote this book about Homer G. Phillips Hospital and its history. And let me just quickly get the business out of the way and tell you that if anybody should wish to order it, there's a piece of paper over here that allows you to call up the publisher and get a 25% discount. The ordinary price, I think, is $40, but with a discount it's $30. So please feel free to take those if you wish to do that. I also put over here some of the other books I've written. There are a number of them, and some of them have to do with Washington University. I've got a book there on the university as a whole, a book that has to do with Barnes Jewish Hospital. I think I have St. Louis Children's Hospital, and also the Central West End. Now these are just examples for you to look through if you're curious at all. We're fortunate enough to have with us several nurses from Homer G. Phillips Hospital, and you'll also have a chance to ask them questions later. So I'll introduce them more when I call on them to say a few words. But is there anyone else here, and I think I've just met 2 people, who have ties to Homer G. Phillips Hospital?
Did you meet Paul?
Yes. Dr. Stewart, can you tell us what your association is with the hospital, or was?
I was a doctor there. I trained there and stayed at Barnes. I was a neurosurgeon.
Well, that's great. Yes.
And Dr. Mila, back there.
I'm a product of Homer Phillips Hospital. I first came to St. Louis as a resident at Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And when I finished my residency, I stayed working as an emergency room physician for 3 years. And then I worked as a supervisor in the medical service.
Oh.
Until I decided, or should I say, I was invited by Washington U to do a cardiology fellowship. And that's when I ended my stint at Homer Phillips Hospital in 1963. And the other thing of my connection with Homer Phillips, my firstborn is a Homer Phillips baby.
That's
And
great.
my nephew is also a Homer Phillips baby because his father did his residency also at Homer Phillips, and that's my reason for going there.
Oh, how nice.
I knew nothing about Homer Phillips until I got to its doors. And
Well,
I
it's-
thoroughly enjoyed my stay there.
What a wonderful memory. Thank you so much. Now this gentleman in the red shirt too. You tell everybody what your association is.
I was born there, as a matter of fact. I was born in Homer Phillips Hospital. So,
That's great. Did you ever go back for any treatment later? Or?
let's see. I think when I was 8 years old, I was there for like 3 days. I had pneumonia.
Oh,
And that was,
okay. Well, you're still here, so they must have treated you well. Yeah.
Over here?
That's good.
All right, hold on. Excuse me, we have another connection over here.
No, over there, right there. Right behind you, Vi.
Oh, my gosh, I didn't see it there.
My connection is quite peripheral in a way. I was medical director of respiratory therapy at the Forest Park Junior College.
Oh.
And we had students on rotation over there, so about once every 2-3 weeks I would have to go over and keep an eye on them, so to speak, and make sure that they were providing the care that we were teaching them to provide. I'm Bill Owens. I'm a retired anesthesiologist.
And I didn't ask for this gentleman in the red shirt too.
Larry Thompson.
Larry Thompson. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
And Mila Banton.
Yes.
Okay, did we miss anybody? Do we have everybody that had a connection? Okay,
So, in case some of you don't know, though, where was Homer G. Phillips Hospital? As you'll see here, and look for numbers 1 and 2, it was located in the Ville neighborhood, part of North St. Louis City. It was a richly diverse area with African American residents at every economic level, and this was really important because it had everybody from janitors to doctors and lawyers, and the people who were more well-to-do in that area really had to live in segregated neighborhoods because there were racially restrictive covenants that prevented them from buying homes on streets, other streets, where they could have afforded homes but weren't allowed to live because they were black. But it was a great place for children to grow up because they had examples of all these people. You could see a doctor and understand what that doctor did. You could see a janitor, understand what that person did. But the rules were strict. For example, you had to politely say good morning to every person you met. And if you didn't, there would be a phone call home to your mother. Like, little Johnny did not say good morning to me, and then you were in trouble. Okay. The Ville was the site of other iconic institutions in the black community: Sumner High School, Antioch Baptist, and other churches, black theaters and nightclubs, and restaurants such as one that the nurses all remember called Billy Burke's, with its famously delicious hamburgers. Nurses, don't you remember it? I heard that whenever there was, they of course had meals in the hospital cafeteria, but whenever there was something they didn't like, they would sneak over to Billy Burke's and enjoy a greasy hamburger. Oh, I forgot to tell you about this picture, if I can get back there. Oops, yeah. Now this is Annie Malone, Annie Malone's Poro College, as you see in the background. Let's see, Annie Malone herself, who founded it, is in the picture, and if you can count 9 from the right-hand side, she's the lady in the sort of clutch-style hat with a mink jacket on. And she's the one who founded Poro College, which was enormously successful in its day, was beauty products. And she actually moved the business eventually to Chicago, but the building remained there. And it became the home instead of a theater and Lincoln University Law School as well. This is the way that visitors would have seen the splendid new hospital when it opened in 1937. It was actually a 5-building complex. In the center, you'll see the administrative core with clinical wings, 4 of them radiating from the core. There were 685 beds in all. And that's important to remember because we're going to tell you later on about a 3-bed hospital that's been opened recently with the same name and why the nurses don't like that. But pediatrics, for example, was on 5 South. Out back, you see the nurses' dormitory, way back there, connected to the hospital by a tunnel. Next to it was an annex for the 76, mostly male, interns and residents. And immediately behind the hospital was a service building with power plant, laundry, paint rooms, sewing rooms, and cafeteria. So it was really a little world unto itself, really. I mentioned that this black hospital opened in 1937 and closed in 1979. Now consider that. It operated for only 42 years, but in that short time it developed a giant reputation locally and even nationally. Its house staff was the largest in the country. 2 years after the hospital opened, it was accepting fully half of the black medical graduates in the United States. And remember, this is a time when they didn't have other places they could necessarily go. I mean, there might have been one spot in a training program, but there were not, they didn't have the access to training programs that, of course, people do now. And its very strict, demanding nursing program produced graduates who could find jobs instantly anywhere in the country. In fact, one woman told me she went out to California, and she was a graduate of Homer G, and went into this the HR office in this big hospital, and they said, "So where did you go to nursing school?" And she said, "I went to Homer G. Phillips." And they said, "You're hired," because it had a reputation for excellence. So how did this remarkable hospital come to be built in St. Louis? Let's first look at what healthcare was like generally for Black Americans in the 1920s and 30s. In a word, it was appalling. Here's a newspaper cartoon of a helpless Black patient being attacked by disease. You see that sort of skeletal figure. He is lying on top of this hospitals, which are giving him no help at all. And notice the bony hand of death lurking to the left. And all of this was sadly true. In the 1930s, Black people were suffering and dying disproportionately from many diseases, especially tuberculosis. What about medical care for Black St. Louisans, especially poor Black citizens? It too was terrible, and from the mayor on down, the entire city knew it. This is City Hospital Number 2, which was the predecessor to Homer G. Phillips. It was located in Midtown St. Louis, but as soon as it opened in 1919, remember Homer G. didn't open until the 30s, it was clear that this 200-bed building was shoddy and much too small, with gurneys routinely parked in the hallways. The health commissioner called the building old and combustible and altogether unsafe. And one newspaper story said it was a ramshackle fire trap. City Number 2 became so congested that many patients were transferred to one of 2 private Black hospitals in St. Louis. Remember that City Number 2 was a public hospital. But this private hospital, Peoples on Locust Street, and the building is still there, by the way, if you drive down, only had 75 beds, so it wasn't much help. Pressure began mounting for a new public hospital for Black patients, larger and more up-to-date than that City Number 2, particularly after a tragic event occurred. A really talented Black trainee was working with some old, defective X-ray equipment when he was electrocuted by a live wire. Clearly, something had to be done, and Black leaders, under the passionate leadership of a young Black attorney, Homer G. Phillips, fought for a new public hospital, which would eventually look like this really magnificent group of buildings. So who was this Homer Phillips, and where had he come from? So let's briefly look at the life and vision of the courageous man for whom the hospital was named. In 1878, he was the second to last child born to a large family living just outside of Sedalia, Missouri, in the tiny town of Smithton. Have you ever heard of that? Smithton, Missouri. While his mother had died, his father, Samuel, a Union veteran of the Civil War, was a farmer there. And this is a photo I took of Samuel's grave in Smithton. Some of Homer's brothers became laborers, but Homer, somehow or another, had serious ambitions. In 1893, the Methodist Episcopal Church had built a new college for Black students in Sedalia and named it for the city's founder, George R. Smith, a Union general. Homer G. Phillips attended this school, no doubt with scholarship help. So he graduated from college. After graduation, he took a year off to work and save money so he could go to Howard University Law School in Washington. And imagine this kid from Smithton, Missouri, which is really very tiny, has these ambitions to go to Washington, D.C. and go to the best law school for Black students in the country. So we don't know where he got his ambitions, but he certainly had them. But before leaving Sedalia, he did something mysterious. He changed his name. At birth, he'd been John Wesley Phillips, but in 1899, he appeared before the Pettis County Circuit Court and petitioned to be renamed Homer Garland Phillips. We don't know why. Stay tuned, because there's another naming mystery later on as well. Okay, so Homer did graduate from Howard, and he returned to Sedalia and began a career there as a lawyer. But a few years later, his father died, and perhaps that was the impetus for him to find a larger stage. In 1910 or 11, he came to St. Louis, married a budding actress, Ida Pearl Alexander, began a successful legal practice, and got involved with the NAACP. Soon he learned that the city was going to replace that wretched city number 2 that we saw earlier with a new medical facility for poor black patients. And for once, the city did have the money. They had $1 million earmarked for this from an $87 million bond issue. But some white aldermen began eyeing that nest egg. That's $1 million was a heck of a lot of money then. And figuring out how to chip away at it for their own projects. They raised a new possibility. Why not build a much cheaper, much more modest black annex to City Hospital Number 1, the white public hospital in South St. Louis? And you probably have seen this hospital. It's now, I think, condos, but it was the white hospital then. Black leaders were not fooled. They saw this quite rightly as an attempt to return to the discriminatory practices of City Hospital Number 2, which had no black faculty in charge, very few black trainees, a white nursing director, and once again, inferior conditions. Some declared that this new idea would amount to segregation with humiliation. Just at that point, a movement to build all black hospitals separately from white hospitals had been growing nationally. By 1900, there were 40 such hospitals across the United States, including Freedmen's Memorial in Washington, D.C., which was probably the best known of them. These hospitals usually had black attendings, black heads of nursing, and a black patient base. This was the kind of hospital that Phillips and others began pushing for, and they wanted it located in the Ville, the neighborhood that we talked about. Now, Homer G. Phillips had many friends by now in St. Louis, but he also had a few enemies, including this black lawyer, George Vaughn. At first, the two were close, but they became bitter rivals when they vied for the same political office. Phillips had another set of enemies too, the McFarland family, who believed he had overcharged them in an estate matter. Then, in 1931, George Vaughn had a dramatic new reason for hating and fearing Phillips. Vaughn was accused of hiring witnesses to testify on behalf of a client. In legal terms, that's suborning perjury. If any of you are lawyers, you know that well. And his trial was coming up shortly. If convicted, he would certainly lose his law license and his career. And the key witness testifying against him, indeed, the only witness, was attorney Homer G. Phillips. He had uncovered damning evidence against Vaughn and was planning to use it in court. On June 18th, 1931, Phillips walked out to his usual streetcar stop near Del Mar, where he always picked up a ride to his office. But this morning, he was accosted by two young men who argued with him, punched him, and then fired 6 shots at him, killing him instantly. This was not a crime committed in the shadows. Many witnesses saw what happened close up and easily identified the two men later. One of them was the son of that McFarland family I mentioned, who were mad at Phillips about some estate matter. The police scooped up the men quickly, and at that point they had no alibis. But suddenly, within days, they somehow acquired several witnesses ready to testify that they were across town at the time of the murder. How odd. Where did they acquire these so-called witnesses? And do we know of anyone who had provided witnesses before? In other words, suborning perjury? At trial, these young men were acquitted. And so was George Vaughn in his trial, since the star accuser, Homer Phillips, was dead. Vaughn continued his legal career and, ironically, even won glory for bringing the St. Louis case that finally ended those racially restrictive covenants. It was a case called Shelley v. Kramer, a very famous case now, to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1948. Let me just add that I managed to get hold of the voluminous police report and medical examiner's report on the Homer Phillips murder, and they raised lots of disturbing questions about the way this case was handled. However, today, Homer G. Phillips' murder is still officially unsolved. Though if George Vaughn didn't have something to do with that, I would be extremely surprised. I mentioned one final mystery related to the name of Homer Garland Phillips. Somehow, when he died, his name turned up on his tombstone in St. Peter's Cemetery in Normandy as Homer Gilliam Phillips. Why not Garland? And we don't know that either. But the hospital he had championed was finally approved and given his name, and here's a photo of the gala cornerstone laying ceremony. City architect Albert Osberg designed the hospital's Art Deco-style building, and it was spectacular. Buff-colored brick, ornamented with yellow terracotta bands. Isn't that beautiful? It really is a beautiful hospital. Take a look at this wonderful postcard again. The building's interior layout was planned by a blue ribbon committee of local hospital officials. Finally, the new complex was finished, and newspapers covered it lavishly, praising its size. It covered almost 2 city blocks, and showing its crisp rows of iron bedsteads. The name, they said, would be Homer G. Phillips Hospital for the Colored, but later it was shortened to simply Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And remember, whereas that city number 2, that horrible building we talked about, only accommodated 200 patients, this accommodated 685. So that's quite a change. And that was the picture you saw was exactly the way Dr. James Whittico saw it when he came here soon after as a resident. I spoke several times with Dr. Whittico, who was more than 100 years old, but clearly remembered everything, including his first sight of the splendid hospital. He told me that as he drove toward it, never having seen it before, he was overcome with emotion at seeing such a building. Not shabby, not second-rate, like most facilities for African Americans were then. In fact, he had to pull his car over to the curb on Whittier Street to compose himself. All he could do was murmur, "Oh my God, oh my God." And I remember very vividly when he told me that story, I thought, that's the way the book will start. And it did. On February 22nd, 1937, a gala dedication took place, including a 2,000-person parade winding through the Ville. Prominent dignitaries were there to speak and be noticed. Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior, the governor, medical deans. Annie Malone came back from Chicago. Even, believe it or not, that rascal, attorney George Vaughn, was there. Also on stage was a heartbroken woman, Ida Pearl Alexander Phillips, the widow of Homer G. Phillips. Altogether, some 10,000 people attended. With more than 300 patients transferring from city number 2, and as I've said a couple of times, it only accommodated 200 patients. So the fact that they were transferring 300 tells you where those extra 100 patients were. They were in the hallways. They were anywhere they could stow them. And new patients arriving every day. Homer G. got off to a busy start. There were more than 500 staff members, and the medical director was Dr. Henry Hampton, who was father of the Henry Hampton, who created the PBS series Eyes on the Prize. In the 1940s came the war years, when residents and nurses went off to serve in World War II. Many nursing students were now admitted as cadet nurses, ready to aid the war effort at home or abroad. The war touched them in many ways, some tragic. There were serious wartime shortages of the new miracle drug, penicillin, and inequities in the way it was distributed. You know, most of it went to the soldiers, but there was some supply left in the United States, and it was very difficult to get hold of it. One nurse recalled that her beloved sister died from a burst appendix On the eve of her wedding to a returning soldier, her father had scraped together the money to buy the penicillin needed to save her life, but it went to a prominent white person instead. She said her mother didn't live more than a year or two after that. She more or less died of a broken heart. In the 1940s and 50s were productive times at the hospital. In fact, some have called them the hospital's glory years. In 1950-51 alone, Homer G. admitted nearly 18,000 people and treated some 56,000 in the emergency room. As nurse Georgia Anderson recalled, Homer G. Phillips was a happy place in the 1950s. We felt that what we were doing was of value to the community and the world, and it was. This staff included more than 100 nurses, along with young nursing students who had embarked by bus or train on the anxious journey from home. Often small towns in the rural South, some were leaving their state for the first time, and they knew one thing clearly, and this is what so many told me. For their hard-pressed families who had helped them scrape together the few $100s of precious tuition money, failure was not an option. They said this over and over. They couldn't fail. They had too many people were counting on them and had contributed to them. In many cases, they arrived as refugees from poverty and discrimination and left as members of the middle class. Georgia Anderson again put it this way: you can't climb up if there's not a ladder or some way to move yourself up. In areas where we came from, there were no opportunities. So Homer G. Phillips was the ladder for me, and I'm not sorry that I started climbing. And that was the seed for the title of my book, which is Climbing the Ladder, Chasing the Dream. Now I'm wondering, Johnny, would you like to get up for just about 3 minutes and tell us about how you got to Homer G. Phillips? Would that be okay? Well, Johnny, this is Johnny Robinson Farrell, who's the second vice president of the Homer G.
First
Phillips.
vice president.
Oh, first vice. Oh, you're promoted. Okay, of the Homer G. Phillips Alumni Association.
Yes, my name is Johnny Farrell. I'm a member of the class of '68, which is the last graduating class of Homer Phillips. I'm from a town in northeast Louisiana called Monroe, Louisiana. And as a high schooler, well, probably around 13, I made in my mind I wanted to be a nurse. There was a comic book at the time called with Patsy Walker, and she had on this beautiful white uniform and a blue cape, and that's what I wanted to wear. And as fortune would have it, we did get a guidance counselor when I was in high school who opened my eyes and my family eyes to Homer G. Phillips Hospital, School of Nursing, excuse me. I'm recovering from a sinus infection, so that's why my voice may come and go. But anyway, my oldest sister was a die-hard St. Louis Cardinal fan, and she would listen to KMOX radio, and she would listen to John McCormick. I'm dating myself, but I'm probably talking a language that most of you know, and she would listen to it late at night, and she would keep me informed. They're talking about closing Homer Phillips. I said, I'm going to nursing school at Homer Phillips. And so when I did get accepted, my parents, as Candace mentioned, went to the bank, borrowed this probably around $700, which covered 3 years of tuition. I'm the youngest of 7 children, remember. I didn't say that. And all of us we were fortunate enough to be able to continue our education. So my statement is probably repeated: failure is not an option. When they put me on that Missouri Pacific train, my daddy worked for Mopac, so I didn't have to pay for that. Put me on that train with that money order, a cashier's check, go and be successful. And I did. So that's how I got from Monroe, Louisiana in 1965 and graduated from Homer G. Phillips School of Nursing, last class, in 1968. And I have never regretted one moment.
It's too bad Georgia Anderson couldn't have been with us today because she had something else she had to do, but she has a great story too about coming from Morrow, Arkansas, which is tiny, tiny. It's a farming community in, I think, northeastern Arkansas. And she lived with her grandparents, and they wanted her to take over the farm when they could no longer do it, but she did not want to be a farmer. So she, in fact, what cemented that in her mind was that one day some neighbor boys came over, and there was the father came over. They had lost their mother recently, and she saw these boys walk in with these dungarees on, with creases, this beautiful ironed creases in these dungarees, and she just looked at them and thought, wow. And then she heard one of the boys saying to the other, you know, I think I'm going to marry Georgia. She can take care of all of us. And she said, I could just see my future ironing those creases every day, ironing and ironing. And she said, and this is her exact words, were, that's not going to be the life of me. So she went to work and got all the money together and managed to get to Homer G, and she became a wonderful surgical nurse. And really, her life was so different. She married and had 2 children, one of whom is an anesthesiologist, and the other is one of the head nurses at St. Louis University Hospital right now. So you can see that would not have happened had she stayed in Morrow, Arkansas. During the 1940s, 50s, and even into the 60s, Homer G was booming, as you can see on this chart. The number of surgeries was always high, in part because of the hectic emergency room. Soon they had 400 births each month. In fact, 3/4 of the African American babies born in St. Louis were delivered at Homer G. Phillips. Who were some of the medical heroes of this key period? Perhaps the brightest star of all was eminent surgeon Dr. William Sinkler, who had trained at the old City No. 2. Afterwards, he joined the Homer G. staff, becoming the extraordinary medical director and then head of surgery in 1956. And he truly was absolutely devoted to the hospital and was just a magnificent head. Dr. LaSalle Lafall, an intern at Homer G. during the 1950s, later became a distinguished surgeon at Howard. And he recalled that Dr. Sinkler had influenced his entire career by demanding respect for every single patient. On rounds, one resident presented a patient, Thomas Sullivan, and made the mistake of referring to him as Thomas did this. Thomas had this wrong. Instantly, Dr. Sinkler bridled. Young man, he said, let me tell you this. So long as you're on this service, you never call a patient by his or her first name. It's Mr. this or Ms. that, which lets them know you've treated them with respect and dignity. And Dr. Lafall said he always did that for the rest of his career. Another hero of the hospital was a surgeon, Dr. William Smiley, who had trained at the hospital himself and later became head of OB/GYN. He had an almost magical operating room style. He would put various instruments like scissors, a clamp, or a retractor on his fingers and flip up whichever one he needed. I can't imagine doing that. Now let's talk about the heroic staff who cared for children, brought in for burns, diseases, accidents, everything. 2 members of that staff were renowned brother and sister pediatricians who both trained at Homer G, Doctors Helen, shown here, and Homer Nash. And maybe some of you have heard of them or even met them. In 1950, Helen Nash became Associate Director of Pediatrics there, as well as the first Black woman to join the St. Louis Children's Hospital staff. She was enormously devoted to her patients, but she was also exacting. As Nurse Jobina Foster, who's with us today, said, Dr. Nash would come through, and a lot of the nurses were nervous about her questions. She'd want to know why this patient's blanket wasn't a certain way. She was strict, but I wouldn't be afraid of her because I knew she wanted us to learn. Her brother was also an extraordinary pediatrician, and this is Homer Nash, but a different personality. Some called him a gentle giant. Do you all know that since 2022, there's been a Nash Way on the medical campus to honor the accomplishments of the Nash family? Yet another hospital hero was actually an institution, the Washington University School of Medicine, which sent medical staff to help out, give lectures, and in the case of Dr. Robert Ellman, to head surgery for many years, and he was truly a remarkable man. His goal and that of Dr. Sinkler was to train young black staff members so they could take over leadership of every Homer G department. And I remember asking Dr. Whitico, I said, Dr. Whitico, were these WashU doctors, they're all Caucasian. I said, were anything condescending to you? Did they ever treat you not like they knew everything? And he said, no. He said, don't let anyone tell you that. He said, Dr. Ellman was wonderful. He was my mentor. He made all the difference to me in my career. He said, he let me take part in research projects. He was just phenomenal. He said, I won't hear a word said against Dr. Ellman. So there you go. Of course, the nurses were still the backbone of the hospital, but they had time for other things as well. They took school-sponsored trips to cultural attractions, they staged performances, they held elegant dances, and they went on dates, sometimes with the male residents. On occasion, they used the tunnels under the hospital to sneak back in after curfew. I'm sure the nurses could tell you stories, but they probably won't. And every day, they had to look professional with their clunky white shoes, their white hose, and especially their perfectly starched caps. And I think the actual credit is, the caption is cut off here, but the Homer G cap, I think, is this one right here? Okay, that's the Homer G cap. So I'm wondering if Lois Jackson could come up for a minute and talk about the hospital and not only what students wore, which I think some of you didn't like those uniforms too well, but what it meant to be a nurse there and what it meant to you.
Well, every time I meet with Candace and she says, can you go here, can you come there, she always gives me a time limit. So I was a class of 1963, and that's been, what, over 60-something years, so how can I take 60-something years and just say, this was it? But anyway, I was born at Homer Phillips, November 22nd, 1941. And my sister was born there, and then my husband was born there in September of 41. So when I was I guess I graduated from high school at Soldan, and then I decided I wanted to be a phys ed teacher. So I went right across the street to Harris Stowe. I stayed there for a year, and I didn't apply myself like I should have. So after D average, I told my dad, I said, well, I won't be able to go back to Harris Stowe. I wanted to be a phys ed teacher. He said, well, what are you going to do now? You might as well go to nursing school. I don't want to be a nurse. I don't want to be a nurse. So then I said, well, I'll go ahead and I'll take the entrance exam. I took the exam and I passed it. All of the other requirements, I got everything together, and I thought, okay, I'll be a nurse. So the first 6 months were the hardest because they made us wear these ugly shoes. We call them old ladies' shoes. They had this real thick sole to it and the big wide front. They put us on a bus and took us down to, where was it, Scrubs, Vanderbilt, Borney, downtown. They measured our feet and they made us wear those ugly shoes for 6 months. And then we had to wear these pinstripe uniforms. And over the top it had like a white apron and a bib. And they were so strict, if you reported on duty or to class with these white stockings on and they had runs in them, or your shoes were dirty, they sent you right back to your room. Even as a senior, if we worked the 11 to 7 shift, they expected us to get off our shift, eat breakfast, and still be in class or go back to work, all in 24 hours. So they were very strict. And our instructors were the type that during our senior year, they made sure we passed state board exam. We had a book that was as thick as a Webster's dictionary. That was back then, not now. But anyway, we had to study this book. It was Mosby's Review of Nursing or something. We had study groups. They put us on that train, and we were up in Jefferson City for 2.5 days. And out of 24 of us, I think 22 of us graduated. So I enjoyed my training, even though I didn't want to be there at first. And what made me decide what I wanted to specialize in when I was on the pediatric floor. And I had this young baby as a patient, and he was the healthiest, fattest looking thing. And then when I read his record, the baby had syphilis. So it was like, you know, they taught us you take care of that patient no matter what the diagnosis is or whatever. And then with psych nursing, that was different too, because they took us down to the Malcolm Bliss Mental Health Center. That was a long time ago. But anyway, they took us down there, and the first day on the ward, they unlocked the door. We walked in, they locked the door behind us. I thought, I don't want to be a psych nurse either. But it's been an experience, yes. And when we would go out and apply for jobs, they never questioned us. When they found out we graduated from Homer Phillips Hospital School of Nursing, we were hired. They trained us for 3 years, and they taught us very well. And they prepared us to be the best that we could be, no matter what our specialty was. We have one alumni member, I think she set up the sickle cell anemia program. Jovina and her buddy were one of the best pediatric nurses that I knew. And Johnny was in the ER. It's like, wow. So they taught us very well. So
Thank you so much, but we need to tell everybody what you did become.
what I did become, I was an occupational health nurse for 25 years, and no, I didn't do physical therapy. I worked in different industries. The first one was American Car Foundry, where they made railroad cars and box cars for the railroad. And my last job was with MEMC Electronics in St. Peters, Missouri, and they made silicon wafers for the computers in your cell phones. So when I got to that last job, I was there for 11 years. Everything they taught me at Homer Phillips, I used it. Yes. So what I didn't tell you was that the first class of 1922 was 4 African-American females. There's a picture on the displays over there. The last class of 1968, there were 34. We first started accepting males in the class of 66, I believe, 65. And then the last class of 68, there were 3 males. So in 68 is when they decided to combine Homer G. Phillips with City Number 1. And that's when they decided they would have Municipal School of Nursing. So the few years they were open, they had 416 students. And also we give out scholarships. We've been giving out scholarships for over 20 years to generic students. Goldfarb School of Nursing has partnered with us. They asked our permission. They didn't do like somebody else to use that name. But Goldfarb asked us for permission, and they're giving out scholarships in the name of Homer Phillips. And let's see, as far as the building is still there. It's still a beacon in the community. In 1982, it was adapted for residential use and reopened in 2003. It was renovated into a 220-bed senior residence. So it is it's listed as a St. Louis landmark in 1980. It's also listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1982. We have displays at the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., the Missouri History Museum in Forest Park, and also the George B. Vashon Museum. So if you've been listening to any of the information out there about the Homer G. Phillips Memorial Hospital and Homer G. Phillips Hospital, you know there's a total difference. Yes, there's no comparison. They can't help us protect and preserve our legacy if they weren't there.
We'll talk about that later.
Am I over my time limit?
That's perfectly fine. Okay, well, let's go back to some of the other specialties. Just really quickly, this was one of the most memorable staff members of all. The petite but powerful Mabel C. Northcross, who ruled in the operating room. She watched everyone like a hawk for the least infraction. One male nurse told me that she wrapped his knuckles with her forceps. Trainees recalled being sent packing if they were just a few minutes late for a procedure. She'd take the trainee by the collar with those same forceps and lead him out saying, "It's not your day, young doctor," and just take him out. And that was it. I guess they learned to be on time. Chief of all the nurses was the director, Ms. Minnie E.T. Gore, appointed to that post in 1951. Here she's shown at a ceremony after her retirement. As Nurse Wanda Trotter said, "Oh my God, I was so scared of her. I was never called to her office," which was a good thing. If you were called to the office, you were in trouble. The students worked hard. Instructors taught them to pull the sheets on the old-fashioned iron bedsteads just as tightly as possible so that a coin would bounce on the surface. Do you remember that? Do you still make your beds that way? You do? Okay. They had classes such as nursing arts, of which instructor Thelma McClendon, known as TMAC, told them that nursing had 3 parts: aspiration, inspiration, and perspiration. One chemistry teacher was Doris Mosley. A nurse recalled that the class was so tough that she'd gotten a D in it. She asked for an appointment with Ms. Mosley and started crying while talking to her. Ms. Mosley reached over and handed me a box of Kleenex, she said, so I could wipe my eyes, but the grade still went home. In this nursing brochure from the period, you can see the range of activities that the nursing students were engaged in. I hope you can see it clearly enough. At the bottom right is the capping ceremony held after 6 months of classes. There was a great milestone on the way to becoming a nurse. And along with their official duties, nurses often had to go the extra mile. Pediatric nurse Lillian Haywood told me the story of an impoverished woman who had given birth at the hospital in the middle of winter. When she left, she forgot her baby blanket, so Ms. Haywood decided to drop it by at her address. When she got there, she discovered the young woman was actually living in an unheated garage out back with only a space heater for warmth. She was keeping her baby's milk cold in the snow. So Ms. Haywood went back to the hospital, reported this to the social workers, and they found her an apartment. As Ms. Haywood said to me, we might have saved 2 lives that day. I'd like to ask Jobina Foster to come up and talk a little about her experiences in pediatrics.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Candace. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jobina Foster, and I'm a graduate of the September 1957 class of Homer G. Phillips Hospital School of Nursing. A very proud nurse I am, I must say, because of my experience there in pediatrics. As a nurse, as I graduated, I worked with the Nashes, both Dr. Helen and her brother, Homer, and also that story about the babies. That building also that you saw was 5 stories high, and Candace did mention that pediatrics was on the 5th floor. That's the highest floor of the hospital for patient care. The other floor, the 6th floor, was for the residents. But let me tell you about the experience there on that pediatric division. Many times we would have a census anywhere from 70 to 100 patients. Each one of our wards, as you saw the wing and how it extended north and south, each one housed girls and boys, infants, from newborns all the way up to 15 years of age. And we had a school nurse that would come, but our census often stayed very high. Back in those days, we had units that were consisting of diarrhea patients. You know, the heat in St. Louis can be very enormous, very high. Remember when we had 101s, 105s, and we had no air conditioning. But the Nashes are the ones who brought us air conditioning to 2 of our most critical units. They were the diarrhea units where when you have that real high fever as a child, as an infant, you will get diarrhea from certain foods that you eat, and your digestive system just cannot handle the temperatures of your body as well as the temperatures outside and the food that you have to ingest. Also on that division, we had patients that would come from all different services of the hospital, and those residents we got to meet. And I was fortunate enough to make rounds with Dr. Helen Nash and Dr. Homer Nash and those senior residents and surgeons and orthopedic doctors and all the specialty doctors that came over. So therefore, my experience in learning has always increased, and we were always expected to be excellent in whatever we did. So I did become a head nurse and later a supervisor. But at the supervisory level, I was transferred to the internal medical male and female divisions, which I did not like. I love the children, and I still love the children, and I will continue to love the children and take care of them. It was a great experience, I must say, Candace, and many of you here have already heard how excellence was portrayed. We could not be anything but excellent in everything that we did, from the head to the foot, from the cape to the dress. It's very important we still utilize those theories and that teaching that was given to us in that remarkable school. It is a beautiful place to have been, and to grow with the number of students that came from all over the United States, all the doctors from all over the world. We were with them side by side. And I remember one doctor used to say, and it's on one of our videos probably or in the book, that if you want to know anything about the patient, ask the nurse. That's how confident they were with us and ourselves being very confident with our specialty and training. What else can I say other than I wish you had been there with us? Many of my nurses, friends in the Homer G. Phillips Nurses Alumni Associate Incorporated, I'm past president of that organization that I love dearly, very passionate about it. Those nurses came from all over, and today, if you go into one of these cities or states, and one of our nurses listed in that directory, you call and say, oh, I'm in town, I'll be there for a weekend, have lunch. Those relationships we established, I didn't have any sisters at the time, and what I saw that prompted me to become a nurse and to hear from Mrs. McClendon's friend about Homer G. Phillips, and to see the nurses come into my mother's home after I was 8 years old to take care of 5 of my sisters and 2 of my brothers. I said, this is how I want to look, and this is what I want to do. Beautiful, black, thick heel shoes, black stockings, and the public health navy blue uniform, immaculate. And you want to look like that every day that you step out of your dormitory room in your white. And you don't get blood on yourselves. Any body fluids? No. We knew how to do all of that. Miss McClendon in first training of those 6 months, how to stay clean. What else can I say?
That's great. I think that's great. Thank you so much.
If you should that.
Thank you. Well, now we're into the end of the hospital, so let me quickly run through that. The beginning of the 1960s, everything was beginning to change at the hospital. 2 of the key leaders, that Dr. Sinkler and Dr. Elman that I mentioned, died suddenly, and the ties with Washington University began to fray. Since the city of St. Louis was losing population and its tax base was dwindling, it began eyeing its 2 public hospitals. Remember, city number 1, the White Hospital, still on the south side, along with Homer G on the north side. It began eyeing the 2 hospitals with a view to closing one of them. Interestingly, a confidential study commissioned by the city showed that Homer G operated more efficiently than city. It said approximately the same amount of surgery is performed in the 5 operating rooms at Phillips as is performed in the 8 operating rooms at City Hospital, but many felt that Homer G was doomed because of racism. Dr. H. Philip Venable, an ophthalmologist, noted angrily that Homer Phillips had everything, but the only thing against it was that it was black. Further, the civil rights era was in progress and residency programs were integrating, so the steady stream of residents began to dwindle since people had more options for training slots. The hospital often had slots open, and increasingly trainees came from overseas, particularly the Philippines and Haiti. The black hospital movement was also ending, and all black hospitals were starting to close. Further, with the enactment of Medicare and Medicaid, the patient census began to decline as patients could use other hospitals as well. Now, Lois talked about the, becoming part of the St. Louis Municipal School of Nursing. The programs merged, the white and black programs, nursing programs merged to form the St. Louis Municipal School of Nursing, which eventually closed in 1981. Through its history, Homer G had graduated more than 1,000 nurses. Meanwhile, Homer G acquired new leadership, including medical director Eugene Mitchell, who also juggled his leadership of the family newspaper, the St. Louis Argus. No one again ever had the same dedication or commitment to leadership that Dr. Sinkler had had. Then in 1977, James Conway took office as mayor on a platform of keeping Homer G. Phillips open, but his comptroller had a different view. He declared in his inaugural address that he wouldn't spend any more money, even for 1 year, to perpetuate the dual hospital system that we have. That was Raymond Persich, if any of you remember that. So the hospital was one hospital was certainly going to close. Some white newspapers came out in favor of keeping City Hospital open, declaring that after all, Homer G was smaller. But others, of course, the black community was really eager for Homer G to stay. Celebrities, including comedian and activist Dick Gregory, came to town to express support, while supporters of Homer G, including staff members, rallied to defend it with sit-ins, sleep-ins, all kinds of rallies. A committee to save Homer G held a 24-hour-a-day vigil, and nearly 50 people were arrested after trying to meet with Mayor Conway. Yet there were signs that the end of Homer G was near, as some patients and services were quietly transferred to city. On August 2nd, 1979, the city declared that no new patients, except ER or clinic patients, would be admitted to Homer G. Then, very early on the morning of August 17th, 1979, staff members coming to work at Homer G heard helicopters overhead and saw busloads of police in riot gear arriving. City officials had carefully planned this day with the police and managed to keep their plans from leaking out. Protesters tried to form a human barrier to keep ambulances from taking patients away, but they were drastically outnumbered. In the next election cycle, Mayor Conway faced serious political consequences. He lost the primary to an alderman, Vincent Shamel, who promised to reopen Homer G. In fact, Mayor Shamel did propose a bond issue to do so, but it didn't garner the required 2/3 majority. Then he gave up, and in 1985, he also closed City Hospital. So the Homer G building languished for years, and then, as Lois said, in 2002, a kind of miracle occurred. A developer launched a lavish $42 million renovation, and it reopened as a beautiful 220-unit senior living facility. But sadly, the Ville hasn't fared as well, and many of the tidy homes that were once surrounding the hospital are now boarded up or gone. As developer Paul McKee, and I guess Johnny will just mention that briefly in a minute, has been discovering recently, there was just one Homer G. Phillips hospital, and people have not forgotten it. So what did it represent? Excellent African American doctors and nurses, creating a high standard of care for their patients, who were all justifiably proud of this extraordinary place. And as one nurse told me gratefully, we can all still see it in its new incarnation. It has risen up out of the ashes like a phoenix, she said. It is still there. But that's all I have, but I think Johnny just wanted to mention in just a couple minutes the current lawsuit. Do we have time for that?
Well, it's 4 o'clock. Well, real quick.
Okay.
Because I know there'll probably be a couple people who have questions.
Okay, sure. Well, Johnny, do you want to just stand up really quickly and tell them about this? I don't know if you've all been reading about this in the newspapers, but Paul McKee is a developer, Northside developer, who has opened. Well, Johnny, you can talk about that.
Yes, in 2022, a lawsuit was filed against Paul McKee, not because we're against the hospital. We want our name. That's our legacy. That's some of our heritage, and we feel that we're entitled to it. The lawsuit was tied up for 2 years in federal court because the judge would not give us a summary judgment or a date. So now the lawsuit has been transferred to the state and will be held in St. Louis County court system, but we still don't have a date. We're trying to get that. But we're just asking for your continued prayers and support because we want that name to stay in the Greater Ville neighborhood. There is some evidence of gentrification with the Ville. They're fighting to bring the Ville back. It won't be a Homer G. Phillips Hospital, but we do want our legacy, and along with the legacy, we can't have a legacy without a name.
Thank you. Well, just as one quick piece of background too, is as you may know, that what Paul McKee has done is open a clinic on the where is it?
Yes, it's a 3-bed facility at Jefferson and Thomas, where the old Pruitt-Igoe housing project stood, and there were it initially was called Northside Urgent Care, but unfortunately somebody suggested that he name it Homer G. Phillips, and when he found out we were going to court, he added Memorial, hoping that would stop the lawsuit, but we're still pursuing this. And like I said in a presentation a couple of days ago, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog, and we're going to fight this.
Okay, thank you.
Is the building still standing?
Oh yes, it is. They did the $42 million renovation that I mentioned, and it's beautiful. It still looks wonderful, and the nurses have held some of their meetings there in the meeting rooms upstairs. And it's really a lovely, lovely facility. They have in the front hallway, in fact, a wonderful metal plaque with the names of all the nurses who have graduated through the years. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And some of the rooms have the names of the former doctors, like Dr. Smiley or Dr. Sinkler and so on.
And we celebrate our 101st reunion in August of last year.
Oh, so last year was, the nurses hold reunions annually, and last year was the 101st reunion. So, any other questions? Yes?
What do they call that facility now?
The Homer G. Phillips Senior Living Facility.
Excuse me?
One over here, one downtown. Which facility are you referencing? Are you the one, the senior Homer G. Phillips Senior Living Facility? So it still has a name.
Yeah, you should drive past it if you like. It's on Whittier, and it's really worth a look. Although, as I say, the Ville itself has been kind of seen hard times recently, I guess. Any other questions?
I think then we can say thank you. Thank you so much. I haven't had a chance yet to look at this wonderful display, but thank you all for coming. Very good.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
And I might add, too, it was Paul who brought to my attention Candace's most recent book. But you're the author of 13 books?
Yeah, something like that.
So
but as I say, there are a few of them.
Prolific author here, and thank you, Paul, for bringing that. So thank you all for being here. Please enjoy the display before we have to disassemble. And again, thank you so much for coming. It's very good.